students, we are back and ready to trim our flange lidded jar. I have a jar here, and this is the way that the lid drops down into the jar. The flange is on the lid, and the knob has been thrown after the lid has been trimmed, and the knob has been thrown on top. So our jar that I threw earlier is ready to be trimmed, but look, we have a very common problem with lids and jars that oftentimes are measured correctly, but the way that they fit is a little snug and the lid doesn't drop down into the jar like we planned. So what do we do in this situation to make things fit? Well, we simply trim the lid or trim the jar down just a little bit. And this is a common situation that potters run into. So when we are throwing our jars, we want to make sure that we leave a little bit of clay up at the top where the rim is slightly thicker. So if we run into this problem, we can always trim a little bit away, either on the jar or on the lid, to make the lid fit. So what I'm going to do before I work on trimming the jar, or the lid rather, is I'm going to trim this jar down. The inside, I'm going to tap this on center so the rim is centered. I'm going to gently and lightly lug down the side of this to hold it into place, but I don't want to put big wet lugs on the side of my jar because I want them to peel away pretty easily. Now, when we trim out the interior, we don't want to trim away a large amount of clay. We just want to trim just a little bit away and then take a measurement. So I trim just a hair, just a millimeter of clay away, and then I stop my wheel and I test. Will the lid fit in there? Not quite, so I have to keep going. We often have to trim in small increments when we're working with lids and fitted forms together, just like our cup and saucer, so we don't over trim and create a very loose fit. There we go. So now our lid drops down into our form. There's no corking. It sits freely from the jar and it fits in really nicely. So now I can set my jar aside and I can start to trim this lid. So this lid is rather thick, and we have the ability to really trim a very wonderful peak into the top of this lid. When we're talking about lids, we really want to talk about form and making sure that we trim something in that doesn't have any flat planes, especially with the lid. You want to have the lid sort of come to a peak, come up, and flow into the knob. It's pretty disappointing when you have a lid that rises up and then flattens out and then comes up to a knob, because the whole line of the form then becomes flattened out. It loses its very fluid line and profile. So when I start trimming lids, I think about this, and I think about how I really want the form to come together, to peak and to sit on top of my jar. So I am going to carefully center this as close as possible to the wheel head. And this is really close to being centered, but it can use just a little bit more centering. Let me find my needle tool. So I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to draw my line around the side of my piece. Now, this is not going flying off the wheel because I stuck it down with just a little bit of water. Now, there's no line here, so that means that this part is pushed in a little too far. So I need to push it out towards the edge a fraction of an inch to align my lid on the wheel. Okay, my lid is centered and my line is going all the way around. I'm just gonna do a quick tap just to make sure that I see it really well. And you will come to see center. You will come to really be able to see center right away with your eyes as you're throwing. So now I'm gonna lug down this lid, and I'm very careful not to bend the edge of the flange here because I don't want to distort this or mess up the integrity of that. I'm going to start my wheel going, and I'm going to start to trim towards the middle. Now, very tempting to start trimming and then just go over the top. Trim a little more and go over the top. Trim more and go over the top. You have to really build up to the center of your lid. So I spend quite a bit of time trimming the exterior and working my way up to the top or the peak of my lid. Oftentimes lids are like the little hats that sit on your form, and they're the first contact that you have with your hand and also with your eyes when you look at a lidded form. So the focal point is really on the lid, and keep taking care of them and really making them nice and well made is a priority. So I'm gently trimming in a small bead right at the base where the edge of the flange meets the peak of the lid. And then I just move right up now to the very top, the very peak of my lid. All right, so I have a nice little peaked point here. I'm going to stop my wheel and prepare my knob. Okay, so it takes a little bit of a learning curve to nail the proportions of your knob to your lid. And you can roll up balls of clay that are what you approximate to be the right size knob for your lid. This is a good size. It doesn't overwhelm the lid, but it's not so small that it doesn't have any stature and it doesn't have any sort of physical presence. So to attach this, I score the peak of my lid, and then I score the bottom of my knob, the underside of my knob. I dip it in a little bit of water, and then I take this and I smush it and wiggle and jiggle this down so it's attached to the wheel. Now I turn my wheel on and I have to center this funny little piece of clay on here. To do that, I use my fingertips and I bear down onto the clay and hold my fingertips really still. I'm going to increase my speed quite a bit because the center of your wheel is always going a little bit slower than the outside edges. And I center up this tiny ball of clay. And once again, this takes practice. It takes doing it a couple times to get it right. The other thing about your knob clay is that it should be extremely soft and some of your nicest clay. You don't want to use any scraps or old lugs to try and articulate a knob. It should be really nice clay So that way you just cancel out any difficulties you might have with clay that isn't up to snuff. Okay, so now I have just a blob, sort of a nubbin on the top of my form, and I'm going to start to come in, undercut this, and create purchase underneath my knob. And we've been throwing round knobs through the other demonstrations. So I'm gonna open up this knob so you can see what a hollow knob looks like. So to open up my knob, I support it on the outside and I use my fingertip and lots of water to open up this ball of clay like it's a mini pot on the top of my lid here. I'm going to squeeze in the stem again. And then I'm just going to use my fingertips to make a mini pole along the side of this knob. I can dip back under, and I can even use my wooden stick, the rounded side, along the side of my knob to give it shape and to give it form. This is really fun. So now I have a wonderful, shapely, whimsical kind of knob for the top of my pot. So to remove this, sometimes the lids get pretty wet when you throw on top of them, and that's why it's really important that you trim them in that leather hard state. I kind of ease the lugs out from underneath my lid, and I press underneath and gently detach the suction of the lid from the wheel. So I'm going to set this aside and let it stiffen up a little bit before I set it on my jar, because it's pretty wet. And now I'm going to take my actual jar, and there's my trimmings from when I trimmed out the rim of this. I'm going to set this upside down on a little puddle of water. Center up this piece of clay. Sometimes they want to center, sometimes they don't. I think we all have that feeling sometimes. Stop my wheel, and I'm going to find some lugs that are a little stiffer because these have gotten wet. I'm going to attach my lugs down. And trim the foot into this little jar. Now I have a sort of teardrop shape to this jar. So I want to keep that in mind as I'm trimming this form. So I carefully go over the surface in a smooth motion, and I roll my tool over the surface following the curve. I find that a lot of beginning students tend to just draw this line and use one corner of their tool, but it's really about flowing over the form. It's really about dancing over the surface. Trim enough clay there, and now I'm going to trim out my interior. Remember, we always trim the outside first, and then we can tackle the inside. Okay. This looks good. All right, so let me remove this from the wheel. Clean my wheel off. So it's always tempting to stick a fairly damp lid onto a pot that you had just trimmed and thrown the knob on. And to get around that problem, so you can see how the forms do come together, is you can take a thin strip of plastic, just dry cleaning plastic, and lay it over the top of your jar. Then you can take your lid, rest it on the jar, and then instead of it sticking, you can always lift it back off by holding up the plastic, so you're not constantly touching the edge of this and removing it. But here's our lidded jar, and we can really see how the forms come together. We can see how the line of the lid flows back down into the profile and the line of the jar. These are things that you really want to think about and you really want to consider when you're putting two pieces of clay together, when you're putting two forms to create a lidded form. Thanks, students.